My name is Rick Caldwell. I'm 70 years old, a retired mechanical engineer living just outside Austin, Texas. Tuesday morning started like any other. The sun was barely up when I grabbed my coffee mug, pushed open the side door, and stepped into the garage. The smell of old motor oil and leather polish still hung heavy in the air. That scent always brought Evelyn back to me, even if it was just for a second. My wife passed away 6 months ago after a brutal fight with cancer. The garage had been her sanctuary. For 20 long years, she poured her soul into restoring a 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. It wasn't just a car. It was her masterpiece. Every bolt, every wire, every panel, she touched it all. But when my eyes adjusted to the dim light that morning, the breath caught in my throat. The space where her Mustang always sat was completely empty. The concrete floor was bare, marked only by a few faint oil stains. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I dropped my coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the floor. I rushed out to the driveway. Nothing. I sprinted back inside, panic clawing at my chest. I dialed my 35-year-old son, Derek. He had a key to the house. He was the only one who could get in without setting off the alarm. He answered on the third ring. I could hear the echoing announcements of an airport terminal in the background. "Derek," I demanded, my voice tight. "Where is your mother's car? The Mustang is gone." There was no hesitation, no surprise, just a cold, calculated sigh on the other end of the line. "I sold it, Dad," he said as casually as if he were talking about the weather. "You what?" I choked out, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter to steady myself. "I sold it," he repeated, his tone edged with impatience. "Monica wanted to go to Paris for our anniversary, and things have been tight. Mom's gone, Dad. It's just scrap metal sitting in the garage collecting dust. Stop living in the past. You need to get over it." I couldn't process the words. My son, the boy we raised, had just sold his mother's legacy to fund a vacation. Before I could respond, I heard his wife Monica yelling from the background. Her voice cut through the airport noise, shrill and entitled. "Tell him to move on, Derek. We have a flight to catch." "How did you even sell it?" I asked, my voice rising. "The title was in her name. I haven't transferred it yet." "I took care of it, Dad," Derek said smoothly. "You know you told me once that everything in that house would be mine eventually. I just expedited the process. I had a towing company pick it up yesterday while you were at the VA clinic. I got a power of attorney form notarized. As a joint heir, I have the legal right. It's done. We're boarding now. We'll talk when I get back from Europe." The line went dead. I stood there in the silent kitchen staring at the phone. My chest ached with a physical pain. That car was Evelyn. It was the hours we spent arguing over paint colors, the evenings she stayed up late reading manuals, the pride on her face when she finally got the engine to turn over. And Derek had discarded it like trash for a trip to Paris. A sickening mix of grief and fury washed over me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to the airport and drag him off that plane. But before I could even formulate a plan, my phone beeped with an incoming call. I looked at the screen. It was Victor Russo. Victor owned a classic car dealership downtown. He was also an old friend of Evelyn's. They used to swap parts and talk shop for hours. I answered the phone, my voice rough. "Victor." "Rick," Victor said, his voice unusually tight and panicked. "You need to get down here right now." "Victor, what's going on? Is it the Mustang Derek said he sold it?" "He did," Victor replied, his words rushing out. "He brought it here yesterday afternoon. Sold it to me for a fraction of what it's worth. He wanted cash fast. But Rick, you need to come down here immediately. Evelyn left something inside." "Left something?" I asked, confused. "I can't explain over the phone," Victor insisted. "Just get here. I swear to God, Rick, you have to see this for yourself." I hung up the phone and did not waste a single second. The grief that had been suffocating me just moments ago evaporated, replaced entirely by a cold and absolute adrenaline. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, my hands steady and deliberate. I did not pause to look at the empty space in the garage as I walked out to my truck. My mind was already miles ahead, processing the impossible variables of what Victor had just told me. I backed out of the driveway and sped toward downtown Austin, my grip on the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. The drive usually took 40 minutes in morning traffic. I made it in 20. I wove through the crowded streets, ignoring the blaring horns of other drivers. My son had sold the car. That was a fact I had to accept. But Evelyn leaving something hidden inside it, something Victor had to call me about, meant there was a layer to this situation I could not yet see. Evelyn was a meticulous woman. She never did anything without a precise and calculated reason. If she hid something in that vehicle, she knew a day would come when it needed to be found. I pulled into the gravel lot of Russo Classic Auto. The morning sun glared off the polished chrome of vintage sedans and muscle cars lined up near the showroom. But I did not look at any of them. My eyes immediately locked onto the back bay doors of the maintenance garage. There it was, the 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. The candy apple red paint gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the shop. Even from a distance, I could see the flawless alignment of the body panels, a testament to the thousands of hours Evelyn had spent getting it right. But my relief at seeing it intact was instantly overshadowed by the sight of Victor pacing nervously beside the open driver's side door. I slammed my truck into park and walked into the service bay. Victor looked up. He was a man who had spent his entire life around engines, usually calm, unbothered, and entirely focused. Right now, he looked like he had seen a ghost. He wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop rag and walked toward me, shaking his head. "Rick," he said, his voice unusually low, glancing around the empty garage as if someone might be listening. "I tried to call you the second he pulled in. Your boy drove up here an hour ago. He tossed the keys on my desk and told me he wanted to liquidate the asset immediately. He did not ask for an appraisal. He did not negotiate. He took my first lowball offer of $40,000 in cash and a wire transfer just to get it off his hands quickly." I stared at the Mustang. 40,000, Victor, the matching numbers on that engine block alone make this car worth triple that. "I know," Victor replied, his jaw tight. "I know exactly what this car is worth. I helped Evelyn source the carburetor parts. But that is not why I called you down here. Listen to me, Rick. 4 months before Evelyn passed, she brought the Mustang in for a final alignment check. I remember it clearly because she looked so tired that day. She pulled me aside, handed me a sealed envelope, and made me promise on my life to follow the instructions inside if anyone other than you ever brought this car into my shop to sell. My mechanical brain processed the timeline. 4 months before she passed. She was already in the late stages of her illness. She knew the end was coming, and she was preparing for a scenario she never shared with me. "What were the instructions?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor gestured for me to follow him to the open driver's side door. I leaned into the cabin. The familiar scent of aged leather and the custom polish Evelyn used hit me instantly, a phantom presence of my wife. But my eyes immediately caught the damage. The center console was pulled apart. The radio faceplate had been completely unscrewed, and the climate control vents were hanging loose by their wires. "She told me," Victor continued, pointing a flashlight into the dark cavity behind the dashboard, "that if anyone but you tried to sell this vehicle, I needed to open the panel directly behind the radio deck. She said she welded a custom bracket back there deep against the firewall where nobody would ever think to look during a standard inspection." I grabbed the flashlight from Victor's hand and leaned further under the steering column. As an engineer, I understood the anatomy of a classic Mustang perfectly. The space behind the radio was tight, filled with a maze of electrical harnesses and heating ducts. But when I shined the beam past the tangled wires, I saw it. Tucked securely against the metal firewall, held in place by a masterfully welded steel bracket, was a small, dark gray fireproof security box. It was perfectly hidden. You could not see it from underneath the dash, and you could not reach it without completely removing the center console components. It was a flawless hiding spot. "Help me get it out," I told Victor. Together, we used a long socket wrench to reach the bolts holding the bracket in place. It took 10 minutes of careful maneuvering to loosen the hardware without damaging the surrounding wires. Finally, the steel box dropped heavily into my waiting hands. It was locked, secured by a heavy-duty brass padlock. I did not waste time looking for a key. I walked over to Victor's workbench, grabbed a heavy steel pry bar, and jammed the wedged end right into the hasp of the padlock. I brought a hammer down on the end of the pry bar with a violent, deafening strike. The brass lock snapped and hit the concrete floor with a sharp clatter. My hands were completely steady as I lifted the lid of the fireproof box. Inside, the contents were meticulously organized, just like everything Evelyn did in life. Resting on top was a silver brass key, the unmistakable shape of a bank safety deposit box key. Beneath the key was a small, worn leather ledger, the kind you use to record daily expenses or log mileage. But it was the document folded neatly beneath the ledger that made the air completely vanish from my lungs. I pulled the folded paper out and opened it under the bright shop lights. It was a legally binding document, heavily stamped and notarized. I read the bold print at the top. It was a general power of attorney, granting full and unrestricted financial and asset control to my son Derek. He had used this to bypass me entirely and legally sell the car. But my eyes immediately dropped to the date written next to Evelyn's signature. October 14th. On that exact day, my wife was in a medically induced coma. Derek had committed federal forgery, and my quiet war had just begun. I stood perfectly still in the harsh light of the dealership garage. My eyes were locked on the date printed in blue ink at the bottom of the page. October 14th. My mind immediately transported me back to that sterile hospital room. I could hear the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. I could smell the harsh antiseptic clinging to everything in the intensive care unit. Evelyn was lying on that narrow bed. Her skin was pale and translucent. She certainly had not sat up and signed a legal document granting our son control over her assets. The signature on the page was a remarkably good imitation. It had the same sweeping loops Evelyn used when she signed checks, but the context made it a grotesque lie. Derek had not just sold a vehicle. He had committed a premeditated federal crime. He had forged his dying mother's signature while she fought for her last breath. The most sickening realization hit me like a physical blow. On the morning of October 14th, I had called Derek from the hospital waiting room. I told him his mother was fading fast and he needed to come down immediately. He told me he could not make it. He was not grieving. He was practicing his mother's handwriting to strip her of her property. The raw sorrow that had clouded my mind for 6 months evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, precise, and entirely mechanical rage. I am an engineer. I have spent my life identifying points of failure and designing permanent solutions. Derek was no longer my grieving son. He was a critical failure. He was a hostile variable, and he needed to be dismantled. I slowly placed the forged power of attorney down on Victor's greasy metal workbench. My hands were no longer trembling. They were completely steady. I reached back into the gray fireproof box and picked up the small leather ledger. I opened the front cover. It was a meticulous accounting log. I turned the pages, scanning columns of dates, account numbers, routing codes, and withdrawal amounts. There were hundreds of entries spanning the last 2 years of her life. The dates corresponded with her hospital stays and the times she was most vulnerable. Evelyn had been documenting a slow, systematic drain on her personal finances. Beside the ledger in the box rested the brass key. I picked it up and examined the heavy metal. It bore the logo of First National Bank. The number 402 was stamped deeply into the brass. A safety deposit box. Evelyn had gathered her evidence, secured the corresponding bank records in a vault, and locked the translation key behind the dashboard of the only object in the world she knew Derek cared nothing about. She knew her son. She knew his arrogance and his complete disregard for her passions. She knew he would never appreciate the craftsmanship of the classic Mustang, and therefore he would never look closely enough to find her secrets. She had built a perfect failsafe to protect me. I turned to look at Victor. He was leaning against a massive red tool cabinet, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes darting between me and the documents on the bench. He saw the shift in my posture. He saw the way my jaw had set, and the way my eyes had hardened. "Rick," Victor said, his voice hesitant, breaking the heavy silence of the garage. "What is it? What did she leave you?" I picked up the forged document and held it out so he could see the date. "This power of attorney is a fake, Victor," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "Evelyn was in a coma on the day this was allegedly signed. She never authorized this sale. Derek forged her signature to liquidate this car, and based on what I am seeing in this ledger, he has been stealing from her for years." Victor's face went pale. "My God," Victor whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "I bought a stolen car. I processed a fraudulent transaction. Rick, I had no idea. I swear to you he walked in here with the paperwork looking completely legitimate. The notary stamp is real. I never would have taken the keys if I had known." "I know you wouldn't, Victor," I replied, folding the document carefully and placing it into my jacket pocket. "You are a good man, and Evelyn trusted you for a reason. That is why she left this here. But I need you to do exactly what I say right now." "Anything," Victor said, immediately standing up straight. "Whatever you need. Do not process this sale," I instructed him. "Do not file the transfer of ownership with the Department of Motor Vehicles. Do not move this money through your dealership accounts. I need you to push this car into your back storage bay. Throw a heavy canvas tarp over it. Lock the bay doors and tell your mechanics to forget it is even here. Keep the transaction suspended indefinitely." Victor nodded vigorously, already pulling a set of keys from his belt to unlock the rear storage area. "Done. It is a ghost. Nobody will see it." I gathered the leather ledger, the heavy brass key, and the empty fireproof box. I walked out of the service bay and placed the items securely on the passenger seat of my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, sealing myself in the quiet cabin. I looked at the dashboard clock. Derek and Monica's flight to Paris had departed 3 hours ago. They were currently soaring somewhere high over the Atlantic Ocean, completely disconnected from the world. They were likely toasting their anniversary and laughing together about how easily they had just manipulated the clueless old man they left behind in Texas. They thought they had executed the perfect crime. They believed the money from the Mustang was safely secured in their accounts, funding a lavish European vacation, while I sat at home paralyzed by my deep grief. But they had made a catastrophic calculation error. They had underestimated Evelyn's brilliant foresight, and they had severely underestimated my capacity for retaliation. I leaned back against the headrest and took a slow, deep breath, regulating my heart rate. If I called the authorities right now, Derek might receive an alert. If I confronted him the moment he landed, he might have the opportunity to transfer funds remotely, delete digital records, or construct a plausible defense. I could not allow that to happen. I needed to let him enjoy his false sense of absolute security. I needed him to believe that he had easily outsmarted me and won this war we were fighting. I needed him to spend the stolen money across international borders, creating a permanent, undeniable federal paper trail. I started the engine of my truck. My destination was definitely not my quiet, empty house. My first stop was the First National Bank to open box 402. My second stop would be the most ruthless trust attorney in the city. The time for my mourning was now officially over. I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom painted pale blue at my mother. Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary in prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight as joined honor societies, and my wife spent 20 years restoring a classic car that became her final masterpiece before cancer took her away from me. When I opened the garage and found her car missing, my own son casually told me over the phone that he had sold it to fund a luxury vacation to Paris. He told me to stop living in the past and get over it. I thought my heart would break all over again. But then the owner of a local dealership called me in an absolute panic. He told me my wife had left a secret compartment inside the dashboard, and what I found inside changed everything. Tuesday morning started like any other quiet day in my empty house just outside of Austin. The sun was barely breaking over the horizon when I grabbed my coffee mug, pushed open the heavy side door, and stepped down into the garage. The familiar scent of old motor oil and premium leather polish still hung heavy in the warm morning air. That scent always brought Evelyn back to me, even if it was just for a fleeting second. My wife had passed away 6 months ago after a brutal, exhausting fight with cancer. The garage had always been her ultimate sanctuary. For 2 long decades, she poured her absolute soul into restoring a candy apple red 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. It was not just a vehicle to her. It was her crowning achievement. Every bolt, every wire, every single panel had been meticulously handled by her hands. I took a sip of my coffee, preparing to walk past her pride and joy to grab my toolbox. But as my eyes fully adjusted to the dim fluorescent light, the breath caught violently in my throat. The massive space where her Mustang had always sat was completely empty. The stained concrete floor was entirely bare, marked only by a few faint drops of transmission fluid. My heart started hammering relentlessly against my ribs. I dropped my coffee mug, watching the ceramic shatter into pieces across the floor. I rushed out to the long driveway, looking frantically in both directions. There was nothing. I sprinted back inside the house, raw panic clawing deeply at my chest. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and immediately dialed the number for my 35-year-old son, Derek. He had a spare key to the house. He was the only other person on Earth who could get inside without triggering the security alarm. The phone rang 3 times before he finally answered. I could instantly hear the echoing, chaotic announcements of a busy airport terminal blaring in the background. I demanded to know where his mother's car was, my voice tight with rising panic. There was no hesitation from him. There was no surprise, no concern, no empathy whatsoever. There was just a cold, incredibly calculated sigh on the other end of the line. He told me he sold it, speaking as casually as if we were discussing the morning weather forecast. I gripped the edge of the granite kitchen counter to keep my legs from giving out. I asked him what he meant. He repeated that he had sold it, his tone suddenly edged with sharp impatience. He explained that his wife Monica wanted to go to Paris for their anniversary, and their finances had been a little tight recently. He told me his mother was gone and the car was nothing more than an expensive pile of scrap metal sitting in the garage collecting dust. He commanded me to stop living in the past and told me I needed to get over it immediately. I could not process the horrific words coming out of the speaker. My own son, the boy we had raised and sacrificed everything for, had just sold his dead mother's legacy to fund a luxury vacation. Before I could even formulate a response, I heard Monica yelling from the background. Her voice cut sharply through the airport noise, shrill and dripping with absolute entitlement. She told him to tell me to move on, reminding him loudly that they had a first-class flight to catch. I asked him how he managed to sell it, reminding him that the title was still legally in her name and had not been transferred. Derek told me he had taken care of it smoothly. He had hired a towing company to remove the car the previous afternoon while I was at my weekly doctor appointment. He claimed he had a notarized document proving he was a joint heir with the legal right to liquidate the asset. He said the deed was done, they were boarding their flight, and we would talk when they returned from Europe. The line went dead with a hollow click. I stood completely frozen in the silent kitchen. My chest ached with a heavy physical pain that radiated down my arms. That car was a physical extension of Evelyn. It represented the long hours we spent arguing playfully over paint colors, the late evenings she stayed up reading mechanical manuals, and the pure pride shining on her face when she finally got the rebuilt engine to roar to life. And Derek had casually discarded her entire life's passion like unwanted trash just to pay for a trip to Paris. A sickening mixture of profound grief and intense fury washed entirely over me. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to drive directly to the airport and drag him off that airplane by his collar. I leaned heavily against the kitchen island, closing my eyes as the crushing weight of the betrayal threatened to bring me to my knees. But before the despair could fully take over my mind, my phone vibrated sharply in my hand. I opened my eyes and looked at the caller identification. It was Victor Russo. Victor owned a highly respected classic car dealership in downtown Austin. He was also a very close longtime friend of Evelyn. They used to swap rare engine parts and talk shop for hours over black coffee. I answered the call, my voice sounding rough and completely broken. Victor spoke instantly, his words rushing out in an unusual panic. He told me I needed to get down to his shop right now. I asked him what was going on, asking if this was about the Mustang, confirming that Derek had just told me he sold it. Victor replied that Derek certainly did sell it. He explained that my son had brought the car into the dealership yesterday afternoon. But Victor insisted that the sale was not the reason he was calling me. His voice dropped to an urgent, frantic whisper. He told me I had to come to the dealership immediately because Evelyn had left something hidden deep inside the car. I stood up straight, confusion breaking through my blinding anger. I asked him what she could have possibly left. Victor told me he could not explain it over a phone line. He demanded that I drive down there right away. He swore to me that I absolutely had to see what he had found. I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our 4-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary in prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight as joined honor societies, and my wife spent 20 years restoring a classic car that became her final masterpiece before cancer took her away from me. When I opened the garage and found her car missing, my own son casually told me over the phone that he had sold it to fund a luxury vacation to Paris. He told me to stop living in the past and get over it. I thought my heart would break all over again. But then the owner of a local dealership called me in an absolute panic. He told me my wife had left a secret compartment inside the dashboard, and what I found inside changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Tuesday morning started like any quiet day in my empty house just outside Austin. The sun was barely breaking over the horizon when I grabbed my coffee mug, pushed open the heavy side door, and stepped down into the garage. The familiar scent of old motor oil and premium leather polish still hung heavy in the warm morning air. That scent always brought Evelyn back to me, even if it was just for a fleeting second. My wife had passed away 6 months ago after a brutal, exhausting fight with cancer. The garage had always been her ultimate sanctuary. For 2 long decades, she poured her absolute soul into restoring a candy apple red 1969 Ford Mustang. It was not just a vehicle to her, it was her crowning achievement. Every bolt, every wire, every single panel had been meticulously handled by her hands. I took a sip of my coffee, preparing to walk past her pride and joy to grab my toolbox. But as my eyes fully adjusted to the dim fluorescent light, the breath caught violently in my throat. The massive space where her Mustang had always sat was completely empty. The stained concrete floor was entirely bare, marked only by a few faint drops of transmission fluid. My heart started hammering relentlessly against my ribs. I dropped my coffee mug, watching the ceramic shatter into pieces across the floor. I rushed out to the driveway. There was nothing. I sprinted back inside, panic clawing at my chest. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and immediately dialed the number for my son Derek. He had a spare key to the house. He was the only other person on earth who could get inside without triggering the security alarm. The phone rang 3 times before he finally answered. I could instantly hear the echoing, chaotic announcements of a busy airport terminal blaring in the background. I demanded to know where his mother's car was, my voice tight with rising panic. There was no hesitation from him. There was no surprise, no concern, no empathy whatsoever. There was just a cold, incredibly calculated sigh on the other end of the line. He told me he sold it, speaking as casually as if we were discussing the morning weather forecast. I gripped the edge of the granite kitchen counter to keep my legs from giving out. I asked him what he meant. He repeated that he had sold it, his tone suddenly edged with sharp impatience. He explained that his wife Monica wanted to go to Paris for their anniversary, and finances had been a little tight recently. He told me his mother was gone and the car was just an expensive pile of scrap metal collecting dust. He commanded me to stop living in the past and told me I needed to get over it immediately. I could not process the horrific words coming out of the speaker. My own son had sold his dead mother's legacy to fund a vacation. Before I could even formulate a response, I heard Monica yelling from the background. Her voice cut sharply through the airport noise, shrill and dripping with absolute entitlement. She told him to tell me to move on, reminding him loudly that they had a first-class flight to catch. I asked him how he managed to sell it, reminding him that the title was still legally in her name and had not been transferred. Derek told me he had taken care of it smoothly. He had hired a towing company to remove the car the previous afternoon while I was at my weekly doctor appointment. He claimed he had a notarized document proving he was a joint heir with the legal right to liquidate the asset. He said the deed was done, they were boarding their flight, and we would talk when they returned from Europe. The line went dead with a hollow click. I stood completely frozen in the silent kitchen. My chest ached with a heavy physical pain that radiated down my arms. That car was a physical extension of Evelyn. It represented the long hours we spent arguing playfully over paint colors, the late evenings she stayed up reading mechanical manuals, and the pure pride shining on her face when she finally got the rebuilt engine to roar to life. And Derek had casually discarded her entire life's passion like unwanted trash just to pay for a trip to Paris. A sickening mixture of profound grief and intense fury washed entirely over me. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to drive directly to the airport and drag him off that airplane by his collar. I leaned heavily against the kitchen island, closing my eyes as the crushing weight of the betrayal threatened to bring me to my knees. But before the despair could fully take over my mind, my phone vibrated sharply in my hand. I opened my eyes and looked at the caller identification. It was Victor Russo. Victor owned a highly respected classic car dealership in downtown Austin. He was a close friend of Evelyn. They used to swap rare engine parts and talk shop for hours over black coffee. I answered the call, my voice sounding rough and completely broken. Victor spoke instantly, his words rushing out in an unusual panic. He told me I needed to get down to his shop right now. I asked him what was going on, asking if this was about the Mustang, confirming that Derek had told me he sold it. Victor replied that Derek certainly did sell it. He explained that my son had brought the car into the dealership yesterday afternoon, but Victor insisted that the sale was not the reason he was calling me. His voice dropped to an urgent, frantic whisper. He told me I had to come to the dealership immediately because Evelyn had left something hidden deep inside the car. I stood up, confusion breaking through my anger. I asked what she left. Victor told me he could not explain it over a phone line. He demanded that I drive down there right away. He swore to me that I absolutely had to see what he had found. I hung up the phone and grabbed my keys. Sorrow was gone. I was running entirely on pure adrenaline. My war had begun. I walked out of the First National Bank with Evelyn's fireproof box tucked securely under my arm and a thick stack of printed bank statements clutched tightly in my hand. The bright Texas sun felt blinding as I crossed the busy downtown street, but my vision was entirely tunneled on the towering glass and steel skyscraper standing directly ahead of me. I was not going back to my empty house. I was going to see a man who specialized in dismantling people who preyed on the vulnerable. Mitchell Harrison was not a friendly family lawyer who drafted simple wills over a warm cup of coffee. He was a ruthless, highly aggressive trust attorney, widely known across Austin as a legal shark who took absolute pleasure in destroying financial predators. I had met him years ago during a complex corporate consultation, and I knew he possessed the exact lack of mercy I currently required. I took the express elevator to the 32nd floor and walked straight past the startled receptionist, placing my heavy box of evidence directly onto Mitchell's massive mahogany desk. He looked up from his dual computer monitors, his sharp gray eyes narrowing suspiciously behind wire-rimmed glasses. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not shake his hand or ask about his family. I simply sat down in the leather chair across from him and pushed the stack of heavily highlighted bank statements toward his keyboard. I told him that my only son had just fled to Paris on a luxury vacation completely funded by the systematic theft of my deceased wife's medical accounts and the highly fraudulent sale of her prized classic car. Mitchell did not say a single word. He understood the grim tone of my voice and the burning severity in my eyes. He picked up the first stack of papers and began to read. For 20 excruciating minutes, the only sounds in the large corner office were the deep, steady hum of the air conditioning unit and the crisp turning of paper pages. I watched his eyes carefully scan Evelyn's meticulously detailed leather ledger. I watched him trace her handwritten notes, perfectly matching the enormous, unauthorized withdrawals from her retirement accounts. He stopped abruptly at the copy of the power of attorney Derek had used at the dealership to sell the Mustang. He stared intensely at the forged signature and the specific date printed next to it. October 14th. I broke the heavy silence, my voice remaining steady and ice-cold. I informed him that on the morning of October 14th, my wife was completely unresponsive in an intensive care unit, breathing through a mechanical ventilator. Mitchell looked up from the forged document, a dark, calculating anger finally settling across his usually stoic features. He leaned back in his heavy leather executive chair and placed his hands flat on the polished desk. He told me that what Derek and Monica had done was not a simple family dispute over a shared inheritance. He classified it immediately as grand theft federal wire fraud and a severe, undeniable case of elder financial abuse. He explained that by forging a signature on a legal power of attorney while Evelyn was physically incapacitated, Derek had crossed a permanent line that carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. Mitchell assured me that we already had enough concrete evidence in that single fireproof box to completely obliterate my son's entire life. But then the ruthless shark in him truly awakened. Mitchell stated that criminals who are arrogant enough to drain critical medical accounts and forge signatures on classic cars rarely stop at liquidating liquid cash. He said that parasitic individuals like Derek and Monica always look for the absolute largest available asset to leverage. Mitchell turned his attention back to his glowing computer monitors. He told me he was going to run an emergency deep background check on my current financial standing and search the county property records for any anomalies tied directly to my name. I sat quietly in the large office while his fingers flew rapidly across his mechanical keyboard. I felt a strange, chilling sense of numbness washing completely over my physical body. The initial blinding shock of the betrayal had faded away entirely, leaving behind a profound and echoing emptiness. I thought about Evelyn suffering through the brutal agony of chemotherapy, knowing perfectly well that her own son was robbing her blind, yet choosing to silently build a flawless legal trap to protect me after she was gone. She had endured so much physical and emotional agony just to ensure I would possess this exact box of evidence today. I owed it to her memory to see this investigation through to the absolute end. I would not protect Derek. I would not shield him from the crushing consequences of his unimaginable greed. Suddenly, the rapid clicking of Mitchell's keyboard stopped abruptly. The silence that filled the large room felt instantly heavier, incredibly thick, with an impending sense of absolute disaster. Mitchell stared at his right monitor for a long, terrible moment. He did not move a single muscle. He did not even blink. He slowly reached over and pressed a blinking button on his desk phone, instructing his legal assistant to completely clear his schedule for the remainder of the afternoon. When he finally looked back at me, the aggressive confidence he had displayed just moments ago had been replaced entirely by a grim, deeply concerned expression. He took a long, deep breath and folded his hands tightly together on the desk. He asked me a very simple question. He asked if I currently held the mortgage on the luxury home Derek and Monica lived in, out in the upscale suburban neighborhood. I shook my head and confidently explained the financial arrangement. I told him that I had generously provided a massive cash down payment for that specific house 3 years ago to help them get started. I explained that the money was a pure gift, but the actual mortgage and the property deed were entirely in their names. I paid for the down payment in cash, I assured him, but I have absolutely no ongoing financial ties to that property. Mitchell reached toward his laser printer as a thick document slid smoothly out into the holding tray. He grabbed the freshly printed pages and pushed them slowly across the smooth desk until they rested directly in front of me. He looked me straight in the eyes and dropped a massive, devastating bombshell that I was completely unprepared to handle. Rick Mitchell stated, his tone deadly serious. The theft of Evelyn's medical funds was just the beginning. You need to look at this property record immediately. I picked up the paper, my eyes scanning the legal jargon until I reached the highlighted section at the bottom. It was a recorded deed of trust for a second mortgage taken out against their suburban home. The loan was $400,000. The signature line made my blood run entirely cold. My name was forged as the sole financial guarantor. If they default in Paris, the bank will absolutely seize my personal retirement home to compensate. The air in Mitchell Harrison's office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I stared at the signature line on the recorded deed of trust, my eyes tracing the familiar loops and angles of my own name. Derek had clearly spent hours perfecting the exact slant of my handwriting, practicing until he could flawlessly replicate my identity. He had used that practiced lie to secure a $400,000 equity loan against the property I generously helped them acquire. He had explicitly named me as the sole financial guarantor for the massive debt. I slowly looked up from the document, meeting Mitchell's sharp gray eyes. He was watching me with the clinical precision of a surgeon evaluating a trauma. He simply tapped a heavy silver pen against his polished mahogany desk, waiting for my engineering mind to fully process the mathematics of my son's betrayal. Mitchell leaned forward, his voice devoid of warmth. He told me to look closely at the payment history attached to the second page of the file. I turned the crisp paper over my fingers, feeling numb. The columns of numbers told a story of financial recklessness. Derek and Monica had drawn the entire $400,000 in a single lump sum payout 8 months ago. They used it to fund a lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. But the most alarming detail was printed in bold red ink at the very bottom of the ledger. They had not made a single payment in the last 90 days. Mitchell explained the brutal legal reality of my situation. The bank holding the secondary mortgage was already initiating the preliminary stages of the foreclosure process. Because my son had legally bound me as the sole guarantor, the bank possessed the full legal authority to bypass Derek completely. They would not waste their time trying to collect from a delinquent, overextended young couple. They would come directly after the deepest pockets available. They would immediately target my primary residence. They would place a heavy lien on my personal retirement accounts. They would dismantle the financial security I spent 40 years building with my bare hands. The sheer scale of the deception washed over me in freezing, suffocating waves. Derek's sudden trip to Paris was not merely an insensitive, poorly timed anniversary vacation taken on the heels of his mother's tragic passing. It was a highly calculated, cowardly, tactical retreat. He knew the 90-day delinquency mark was the absolute threshold before the bank unleashed their aggressive collection agents. He knew the final warning notices were currently making their way through the postal system. He had stolen the classic Mustang, liquidated it for fast cash, and fled across the Atlantic Ocean. He fully intended to sit in a luxury European hotel, sipping expensive wine while the ruthless mechanisms of the banking industry destroyed his grieving father. My son had planned to let me go completely bankrupt. He had actively orchestrated my absolute financial ruin. I placed the documents back onto the desk and smoothed out the slight creases my fingers had left in the paper. The profound sorrow that had anchored me to my bed for the past 6 months was entirely gone. The phantom weight of Evelyn's absence no longer paralyzed me. Instead, my mind became a fortress of cold, focused calculation. I am a retired structural engineer. I have spent my professional life identifying catastrophic structural failures and designing permanent, unyielding solutions. My son had just become the most significant critical failure of my entire life. He was a hostile, destructive variable, and he needed to be systematically neutralized before he could collapse my foundation. I looked at Mitchell, my voice dropping an octave, completely stripped of any parental affection. I told him that I refused to be a victim of this parasitic scheme. I asked him exactly what our immediate tactical options were. I demanded a comprehensive strategy to sever my financial tether to Derek and shift the full crushing weight of the law directly onto his shoulders. Mitchell offered a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. He opened a thick leather binder and pulled out a legal pad. He told me that we were going to completely rewrite the rules of this engagement while my son was still 30,000 feet in the air. He explained that because the forgery crossed state and federal lines involving electronic bank transfers, we were no longer dealing with a simple civil dispute. We were operating firmly in the realm of federal criminal fraud. The first step Mitchell outlined meticulously was to immediately file a sworn affidavit of forgery with the local authorities and the banking commission. We would officially declare the power of attorney used to sell the Mustang and the signature on the $400,000 equity loan as completely fraudulent. This action would trigger an absolute freeze on all connected accounts. It would legally halt the bank from placing a lien on my retirement home, transferring the investigative focus directly onto Derek's fraudulent actions. The second step was far more aggressive. Mitchell told me he would personally contact the fraud department of the financial institution that issued the equity loan. He possessed high-level contacts within their executive division. He would provide them with Evelyn's ledger, the false power of attorney, and my sworn statement. Once the bank realized they had released $400,000 based on a fabricated signature, they would instantly freeze Derek and Monica's personal checking and savings accounts. They would flag their credit cards for immediate suspension. I pictured my son and his wife stepping off their first-class flight at the Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. I imagined them walking confidently up to the customs counter, unaware that the financial ground beneath their feet had just been completely vaporized. I visualized Monica attempting to hand her platinum credit card to a luxury hotel concierge only to have it brutally declined. They were flying into a meticulously constructed trap, completely disconnected from the digital world, totally oblivious to the storm I was unleashing upon them. I leaned forward, clasping my hands tightly together. I told Mitchell to execute the plan immediately. I authorized him to utilize every aggressive legal maneuver in his arsenal. I told him I did not care about the associated legal fees. I did not care about preserving any relationship with my son. Derek had severed our familial bond the exact moment he forged his dying mother's signature and plotted the destruction of my home. He had initiated a brutal financial war, assuming I was too weak and too consumed by grief to fight back. Mitchell nodded, his pen flying across the pad, drafting action items. He called his paralegal, barking instructions to prepare affidavits and contact federal investigators. The room became a whirlwind of aggressive legal preparation. I sat perfectly still in the center of the storm, feeling a strange, dark sense of peace settling into my bones. Evelyn had left me the map. She had endured her silent agony to provide me with the exact ammunition I needed. I was simply loading the weapon. The clueless old man they dismissed was about to become their nightmare. The silence in the office was deafening. I looked at the date on the default notice and did the brutal math in my head. I had mere days before the bank initiated a formal foreclosure process on the property I had spent my entire life paying off. A civil lawsuit would take months, perhaps years, to untangle the mess my son had deliberately created. I did not have months. I did not even have weeks. I needed the full weight of the federal government to intervene, and I needed it to happen immediately. Mitchell did not waste a single second offering empty platitudes. He understood the lethal urgency of our timeline. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket, bypassing his office line entirely. He told me he was calling a direct contact he had cultivated over a decade of practicing trust law. The man was a senior agent in the financial crimes divisions of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mitchell explained that cases of this magnitude involving wire fraud, forged real estate deeds, and the exploitation of a dying woman were exactly what the Bureau hunted. I sat perfectly still as Mitchell made the call. He spoke in low, clipped sentences using precise legal terminology to convey the sheer scale of the theft. He mentioned the fraudulent power of attorney, the looted medical accounts, and the forged secondary mortgage currently threatening my primary residence. When he ended the brief call, he looked across the desk at me. He stated that Special Agent Thomas Vance was currently on his way down to our location, and we needed to prepare the evidence for a flawless presentation. We moved from Mitchell's private office into a large, secure conference room down the hall. I emptied the contents of Evelyn's fireproof box onto the polished wooden table. We arranged the highlighted bank statements, the meticulous leather ledger, the forged power of attorney, and the fraudulent loan documents into a chronological timeline of absolute betrayal. My engineering background demanded structure and precision. I approached the table not as a grieving husband or a devastated father, but as a forensic analyst deconstructing a catastrophic system failure. Special Agent Vance arrived exactly 20 minutes later. He was a tall, remarkably imposing man with sharp features and a completely unreadable expression. He wore a dark gray suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. Mitchell made the introductions quickly, skipping all pleasantries to respect the ticking clock hanging over my retirement home. Vance took a seat at the head of the conference table. He did not offer any false sympathy regarding my deceased wife or my treacherous son. He simply unclasped his briefcase, pulled out a digital recording device, and asked me to walk him through the precise anatomy of the crime. I stood at the edge of the table and took a deep, stabilizing breath. I began with the foundation of the deception. I pointed to the original power of attorney document Derek had presented to Victor at the classic car dealership and subsequently used to leverage the massive equity loan. I directed Vance's attention to the specific date printed next to the notary seal. October 14th. I explained to the federal agent that my wife was a meticulous record keeper, but on that specific October morning, she was completely incapable of holding a pen. I opened a separate folder I had brought from my truck containing Evelyn's comprehensive medical records from the intensive care unit. As a career engineer, I know that numbers and timelines do not lie. I laid out the daily medical logs directly beside the forged financial documents. I walked Agent Vance through the undeniable, irrefutable data. I showed him the exact dosage of powerful sedatives pumping through her veins on the morning of the 14th. I pointed to the hourly nursing charts documenting her profound lack of consciousness. She was breathing through a mechanical ventilator heavily restrained by medical tubing and fighting a systemic infection that was rapidly shutting down her organs. It was a physical, biological impossibility for her to have authorized a comprehensive transfer of her financial assets. Then I opened Evelyn's small leather ledger. I explained how my wife had suffered in silence during the early stages of her cognitive decline. She had noticed the small, unexplained withdrawals from her personal accounts months before she was hospitalized. Instead of confronting a son she knew would simply lie to her face, she began quietly gathering a verified paper trail. I showed Vance how she had meticulously logged every unauthorized transfer, cross-referencing them with the corresponding bank statements she had locked away in her safety deposit box. I told the agent that Evelyn had deliberately skipped purchasing her expensive pain medications on multiple occasions just to ensure those specific funds remained stagnant. When Derek drained those specific accounts, he unknowingly triggered a documented anomaly that Evelyn recorded in her ledger. She had sacrificed her own physical comfort to build a flawless, unassailable chain of evidence. She had mapped out his parasitic behavior with the clinical precision of a master architect designing a vault. Special Agent Vance listened to my entire presentation without interrupting once. He examined the medical charts, compared the forged signatures against Evelyn's actual handwriting, and traced the flow of stolen capital through the highlighted bank statements. He picked up the brass key and held it up to the fluorescent lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a grim professional respect for the trap my wife had posthumously laid. Vance stated the evidence I presented was absolutely compelling. He confirmed that the forged mortgage document alone was sufficient to initiate a federal injunction to halt the impending foreclosure on my home. Mitchell immediately began drafting the necessary injunction paperwork, his pen moving furiously across a fresh legal pad. However, Vance leaned forward and folded his hands deliberately on the table. He explained that securing my property was only the defensive portion of our strategy. To build an airtight federal wire fraud case that would guarantee a lengthy prison sentence, the Bureau needed something more dynamic. They needed to establish a continuous, undeniable chain of custody for the stolen funds. Vance told me local theft was one thing, but transferring illicit capital across international borders elevated the crime to a different federal jurisdiction. He stated Derek and Monica were currently in the air flying toward Paris, with hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen equity and liquidated vehicle assets. To lock the proverbial cage, federal authorities needed to prove my son and daughter-in-law were actively, aggressively spending that laundered money in a foreign country. The next phase of our operation relied entirely on their profound arrogance. We needed them landing in Europe. We needed them to check into their luxury hotel, dine at expensive restaurants, and swipe their cards with absolute impunity. The moment they initiated a transaction on foreign soil, they would generate the irrefutable digital footprint the FBI required to execute an international arrest warrant. My arrogant son genuinely thought that he had successfully escaped. He did not realize his luxury vacation was actually the final mechanism in his very own absolute destruction. I sat perfectly rigid in the sterile windowless conference room of the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office located deep in the heart of downtown Austin. The industrial air conditioning hummed with a low mechanical drone chilling the cold sweat that had gathered on the back of my neck. Special Agent Thomas Vance sat directly across from me, his expression completely unreadable as he slid a thick, heavy stack of federal affidavits across the polished metal table. Mitchell Harrison sat to my right, his sharp eyes scanning every single paragraph before offering a silent nod, signaling me to proceed. I picked up the heavy black pen and began affixing my signature to the legal documents. With every deliberate stroke of ink, I was formally and permanently severing the paternal bond I had once shared with my son. I was legally swearing under the strict penalty of perjury that the massive $400,000 equity loan was a completely fraudulent mechanism, and that the power of attorney used to liquidate Evelyn's classic car was a grotesque, undeniable forgery. The room was entirely devoid of any warmth, a stark contrast to the burning fire of betrayal that currently consumed my chest. We were constructing a massive, inescapable federal cage, and we were utilizing Derek's own immense arrogance as our primary building material. I placed the pen down on the cold metal table, feeling a profound, heavy sense of finality settling over my tired bones. There was absolutely no turning back now. The federal machinery had been officially activated. Agent Vance tapped the smooth surface of his tablet, transferring his screen display to the large digital monitor mounted securely on the far wall of the conference room. The bright screen flickered for a brief moment, immediately replacing the stark white federal crest with the colorful, highly filtered interface of an Instagram profile. It was Monica's public account. She had never bothered to adjust her privacy settings, completely convinced that her highly curated life of luxury was meant to be admired and envied by the anonymous masses. Now that same blinding vanity was serving as a live, high-definition broadcast of her active federal crimes. Vance offered a quick nod to a junior cyber analyst sitting quietly in the corner, who immediately began syncing Monica's social media timestamps with the real-time financial tracking algorithms connected to the stolen accounts. The first vivid image flashed onto the large screen. It was a high-resolution video uploaded just a few short hours prior. Derek and Monica were sitting comfortably in the plush, oversized leather seats of a first-class airline cabin. They were smiling brightly, clinking crystal flutes filled with incredibly expensive champagne. Monica's voice echoed loudly through the quiet FBI conference room, sounding shrill and dripping with absolute unearned entitlement as she boldly bragged to her digital followers about their spontaneous romantic anniversary getaway. She slowly panned the camera lens to Derek, who offered a smug, deeply relaxed smile to the audience. He was completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that his father was currently sitting in a secure federal building, meticulously watching his every single move alongside top government investigators. I stared intensely at my son's face on the monitor. He did not look like a man heavily burdened by the terrible weight of stealing his dead mother's legacy. He looked exactly like a man who genuinely believed he had flawlessly outsmarted the entire world. The junior cyber agent typed rapidly on his illuminated keyboard, and a secondary tracking window appeared directly next to the Instagram video. It displayed the raw digital transaction history for the highly fraudulent equity line of credit. The exact timestamp on those first-class airline tickets matched perfectly with a massive cash withdrawal executed just 48 hours before their scheduled departure. Every single dollar they spent was being tracked, verified, and legally cataloged by the federal government. The social media updates continued to populate the large monitor in strict chronological order, flawlessly documenting their arrival in France. The next series of bright photographs showed them standing proudly in the opulent gilded lobby of the world-famous Ritz Paris. Monica had posted a long panoramic video of their sprawling luxury suite, proudly showcasing the breathtaking view of the Eiffel Tower shining in the distance. The video highlighted the heavy velvet drapes, the antique furniture, and the extravagant, incredibly expensive spread of caviar and fresh truffles waiting patiently on the formal dining table. Her digital caption read, "Living our absolute best life." My stomach turned violently, not from any lingering sorrow, but from an overwhelming, crushing wave of pure, unfiltered disgust. Every single aspect of that lavish, boastful display was directly funded by the forged signature that was currently threatening to leave me completely homeless and entirely bankrupt. Evelyn had physically denied herself vital, necessary pain medication simply to meticulously build a hidden paper trail. And here was her son casually blowing her entire life savings on transient, highly superficial luxury. The cyber analyst quickly brought up the next undeniable financial correlation. The massive deposit for the Ritz Paris suite had been authorized using a bank card directly tethered to the stolen Mustang funds. The screen refreshed once again, displaying a rapid, frantic succession of short video clips from the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Monica was strutting down the famous cobblestone street, her arms absolutely loaded with heavy, expensive shopping bags, bearing the unmistakable iconic logos of Louis Vuitton, Chanel, and Christian Dior. She twirled playfully for the camera lens, laughing loudly, with a reckless, completely unearned joy. She was literally documenting her own federal wire fraud for the entire world to witness in real time. Every single time, she happily handed that stolen credit card to a high-end French boutique cashier. The digital financial signal bounced instantly across the Atlantic Ocean, traveling directly into the secure FBI servers. The junior agent was methodically and precisely highlighting each specific international transaction, slowly building an unbroken, legally irrefutable chain of hard evidence. They were not merely spending stolen money. They were actively establishing a continuous, undeniable pattern of highly illegal cross-border financial crimes. Agent Vance watched the bright screen with a cold, terrifyingly predatory focus. He calmly explained to me that international wire fraud and the interstate transportation of stolen property were incredibly serious federal offenses, and Monica's relentless narcissistic need for immediate social validation was providing the prosecution with an absolute goldmine of undisputable time-stamped evidence. I sat back slowly in my metal chair, my eyes locked permanently on the endless, sickening stream of luxury purchases flashing across the monitor. Derek had always firmly believed that he was the smartest person in any given room. He had always viewed my quiet, highly methodical nature as a severe personal weakness. He truly thought my profound grief had rendered me completely blind to his parasitic, destructive behavior. He was currently walking confidently through the romantic, historic streets of Paris, completely convinced that he had successfully orchestrated the perfect financial execution of his own father. But the devastating reality was that every single euro they happily spent was pulling the invisible federal noose drastically tighter around their own throats. Suddenly, the secure red telephone resting on the center of the conference table rang with a sharp, piercing tone that shattered the silence. Agent Vance quickly picked up the heavy receiver, listening intently for a few brief, tense seconds before offering a single highly decisive nod. He placed the phone back down securely and looked directly across the table at me. The final overarching federal warrant had just been officially signed by a United States district judge. The legal authorization to completely seize their assets permanently, freeze the fraudulent equity accounts, and initiate the international arrest protocol was now fully active. Mitchell Harrison leaned forward, a grim, deeply satisfied smile forming slowly on his face. Agent Vance turned to the junior cyber analyst sitting in the corner and issued a single devastating command. It was time to permanently pull the plug on every single credit card, bank account, and financial lifeline Derek and Monica possessed. The junior agent did not hesitate. His fingers danced across the illuminated keyboard with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. I sat in the silent conference room and watched as the digital windows on the large monitor began to refresh. The primary checking account that Derek had meticulously drained from his mother's life savings was the first to change status. A bold, glaring red banner flashed across the upper quadrant of the screen, changing the account classification from active to severely restricted. The agent then moved to the secondary savings accounts. The joint credit cards and the heavily leveraged international travel cards Monica had just been casually swiping along the historic streets of Paris. One by one, the federal algorithms isolated the routing numbers, severed the digital authorizations, and locked the capital behind an impenetrable wall of government encryption. In less than 3 minutes, my son and his entitled wife were entirely cut off from the global financial system. They were essentially stranded in a foreign country, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the useless plastic rectangles in their expensive designer wallets. Agent Vance stood up from the conference table, smoothing his dark suit jacket, with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked at me and confirmed that the international wire fraud protocol was now fully operational. He explained that the European authorities would be quietly notified of the impending arrest warrants, ensuring Derek could not simply board a train and slip away into another jurisdiction. The trap we had built was completely sealed. I thanked the federal agents for their swift, decisive intervention, feeling a profound sense of justice settling deeply into my chest. Mitchell Harrison placed a firm hand on my shoulder and guided me out of the federal building. We stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun, but our critical work was not yet finished. We drove back to his private law office in complete silence, the weight of the impending fallout hanging heavily between us. As soon as we walked through his heavy glass doors, Mitchell summoned his senior paralegal and demanded the emergency injunction paperwork. The federal freeze had successfully trapped Derek, but I still needed absolute protection against the aggressive banking executives who held the fraudulent secondary mortgage on my retirement home. Mitchell did not merely send an email or make a polite phone call. He personally drafted a highly aggressive legal mandate, attaching my sworn affidavit of forgery, the corresponding federal crime case numbers, and a direct threat of massive civil litigation against the financial institution if they dared to proceed with the impending foreclosure. He dispatched a specialized courier to deliver the mandate directly into the hands of the bank's regional vice president. 2 hours later, Mitchell's desk phone rang. It was the bank's senior legal counsel, his tone completely stripped of the predatory confidence they typically reserved for delinquent debtors. They had received the federal case file. They had seen the absolute proof of my son's calculated forgery. Mitchell aggressively dictated our unyielding terms, demanding an immediate permanent release of the fraudulent lien placed against my property. By the time the sun began to slowly set over the Austin skyline, my physical assets were completely secured. My home, the sanctuary Evelyn and I had built over 40 years of marriage, was officially safe from Derek's toxic, destructive reach. I drove back to my quiet, empty house as the evening shadows stretched long and dark across the paved driveway. I parked my truck, stepped out into the cool air, and unlocked the heavy front door. The house was entirely silent, but it no longer felt like a place of mourning. The crushing, paralyzing grief that had suffocated me for 6 long months had been completely burned away by the sheer magnitude of my son's betrayal. I did not walk into the kitchen to make dinner. I did not sit in the living room to watch the evening news. I walked directly down the long carpeted hallway and stood before the closed wooden door of Derek's old childhood bedroom. I pushed the door open and turned on the overhead light. The room had remained largely untouched since he moved out over a decade ago. Evelyn had always insisted on keeping his old sports trophies perfectly aligned on the wooden shelves. She had carefully preserved his framed high school diplomas, his vintage comic books, and the expensive acoustic guitar I had purchased for his 18th birthday. Looking at these carefully preserved artifacts of his youth, I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering parental affection. The boy who had inhabited this room no longer existed. He had been completely replaced by a cold, calculating predator who had actively preyed on his dying mother and plotted the total financial ruin of his grieving father. I walked down the hall to the utility closet and retrieved a heavy roll of thick black industrial garbage bags. I returned to the bedroom and began to work with a ruthless, highly mechanical efficiency. I swept the gleaming sports trophies off the shelves, listening to the hollow plastic clatter as they hit the bottom of the plastic bag. I tore the framed diplomas off the painted drywall, shattering the glass without a single moment of hesitation. I grabbed the expensive acoustic guitar by its polished wooden neck and drove it violently against the edge of the heavy oak desk, splintering the hollow body into jagged, useless pieces. I tossed the broken wood into the trash. I systematically stripped the entire room of its history. Every photograph, every cherished memory, every single physical tether connecting me to that treacherous man was unceremoniously dumped into the black industrial bags. I dragged the heavy bags out to the edge of the street, piling them high beside the municipal waste bins. The father who had unconditionally loved and protected Derek was entirely gone. Only the survivor remained, and I had absolutely zero room in my life for a hostile threat. I poured a glass of bourbon and sat in my recliner. I placed my phone onto the glass coffee table. The digital clock glowed. The time difference meant the sun was currently rising over Paris. Derek and Monica would be waking up in their luxurious hotel suite. They would likely order room service, completely oblivious to the federal snare that had closed around them while they slept. They would laugh, plan their shopping itinerary, and then attempt to pay their hotel bill. I took a slow sip of bourbon, staring intently at my phone, watching the minutes tick by. I knew with absolute certainty that the call was inevitable. The moment that stolen card was declined, panic would instantly set in. Derek would attempt to log into his banking applications, only to find himself locked out by federal encryption. He would realize his plan had imploded. Desperate for an explanation, he would have no choice but to reach out to the man he thought he had destroyed. I sat in the silence of my home, waiting for the ringtone to break the quiet morning air. It was now only a matter of time before the heavy financial guillotine dropped in France. The sun cast a golden glow over the historic rooftops of Paris, bathing the city in a warm light. It was day 3 of their planned anniversary vacation. Derek and Monica were completely oblivious to the federal snare that had quietly pulled taut around their ankles while they slept. Inside their opulent suite at the Ritz, they woke up wrapped in expensive linen, blissfully isolated from the devastating reality waiting for them. Monica ordered a lavish room service breakfast of fresh pastries and imported coffee, unaware that it would be the exact last luxury she would experience. Halfway across the world, I remained perfectly still in my leather recliner, watching the clock tick away the quiet Texas morning. The bourbon in my glass had long since warmed to room temperature, but I did not take another sip. I simply waited, listening to the heavy silence of my empty house. My mind calculated the exact trajectory of their impending ruin. They were stepping out onto the bustling Parisian streets, armed with stolen capital and an infinite sense of unearned entitlement. They felt invincible. Their morning itinerary was entirely focused on aggressive, unapologetic consumption. Monica chose the massive Christian Dior boutique on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées as her primary target for the day. They walked through the towering glass doors with the supreme confidence of royalty, immediately demanding the attention of the impeccably dressed sales associates. Monica glided across the polished marble floors, running her manicured fingers over delicate silk garments and examining the intricate craftsmanship of imported leather goods. She was thoroughly enjoying the deferential treatment, soaking in the polite smiles and the offered glasses of sparkling water. She finally stopped in front of a heavily illuminated display case holding an exclusive limited edition handbag. It was a pristine white leather tote accented with heavy gold hardware, carrying a price tag of exactly 5,000 euros. Monica barely glanced at the exorbitant price. She simply pointed her finger and instructed the eager sales associate to box it up immediately. Derek stood proudly by her side, a smug grin plastered across his face. He felt like a king providing for his queen, completely forgetting that his crown was entirely forged from his dying mother's stolen medical funds. They approached the sleek, modern register counter, casually sipping their complimentary water. Monica reached into her designer purse and retrieved her heavy platinum credit card. It was the primary card tethered directly to the fraudulent $400,000 equity loan my son had maliciously strapped to my retirement home. She handed it to the cashier with a practiced, arrogant flick of her wrist. The elegantly dressed clerk smiled politely, inserted the platinum card into the terminal, and waited for the customary approval tone. Instead, the machine emitted a sharp, highly disruptive electronic beep. The cashier frowned, muttering a soft apology in French, and processed the card a second time. The machine beeped again, louder and more insistent. The clerk looked up, her polite smile slipping into a mask of professional discomfort. She softly informed Monica that the transaction had been declined by the issuing institution. Monica let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh of pure annoyance. She snatched the card back, claiming it was merely a ridiculous international security hold, and confidently handed the cashier a secondary credit card linked to Evelyn's drained retirement accounts. The clerk swiped it smoothly. Denied. The sharp beep echoed uncomfortably through the quiet, luxurious boutique. A deep, hot flush of embarrassment began to creep up Monica's neck. Her arrogant facade cracked, replaced by a sudden sharp surge of pure indignation. She loudly demanded that the clerk run it again, insisting that the machine was obviously broken and that she had more than enough capital to buy the entire store. Derek stepped forward, attempting to smooth over the escalating situation with his customary false charm. He pulled out his own premium leather wallet, offering an apologetic chuckle to the gathered staff. He handed the cashier his primary business card, a direct financial line to his personal banking portfolio. The clerk hesitated for a brief second before carefully sliding the thick plastic through the digital reader. The terminal did not just beep this time. The small digital screen flashed a bright, glaring red warning message. The clerk stared at the terminal, her eyes widening in absolute shock. She slowly looked up at Derek and informed him, her voice trembling slightly, that the card was not just declined. The banking system had explicitly flagged the account with a severe fraud alert, issuing an immediate mandate to seize the physical card. The machine was demanding that the merchant confiscate the plastic on behalf of federal authorities. The atmosphere inside the boutique shifted from polite deference to immediate icy hostility. The store manager, a tall, imposing man with an immaculate suit and a completely unyielding expression, quickly stepped out from the back office. He smoothly stepped between the panicked cashier and my son. He politely, but incredibly firmly informed Derek and Monica that they would not be making any purchases today. Monica's embarrassment instantly mutated into a massive, uncontrolled public tantrum. She began screaming at the manager, pointing her finger aggressively in his face, completely destroying the quiet elegance of the high-end boutique. She shrieked that they were wealthy Americans, that they were being horribly disrespected, and that she would ensure the entire staff was fired for this unprecedented humiliation. The manager did not flinch. He simply motioned to the large security guard standing quietly near the entrance. With a voice stripped of all previous warmth, the manager ordered my son and his screaming wife to exit the premises immediately, warning them that he would contact the local Parisian police if they refused to comply. Other wealthy patrons stopped browsing, openly staring at the incredibly public, deeply humiliating spectacle unfolding before their eyes. Derek grabbed Monica by the arm, roughly pulling her away from the counter. They stumbled backward out of the heavy glass doors, effectively thrown out onto the bustling Parisian sidewalk like common vagrants. The crisp European morning air hit them, but it offered absolutely no comfort. Derek pulled his mobile phone from his jacket pocket, his hands trembling violently. He ignored Monica's relentless, hysterical demands for an explanation. He aggressively tapped the screen, loading his primary mobile banking application. He needed to transfer funds from their main savings portfolio immediately to fix this ridiculous error. The application loading screen spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the main dashboard finally appeared. Derek stopped breathing. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His primary checking account balance read exactly 0. His secondary savings account read exactly 0. His investment portfolio read exactly 0. Every single financial safety net he possessed had been completely eradicated. But the absolute worst part was the bold, uncompromising message plastered across the top of his digital screen. The text read, "Account frozen by order of the United States federal government. Please contact federal authorities immediately." Stranded, humiliated, and panicking, Derek made a fatal mistake. He called the man he thought was a clueless old man. I answered the phone. The device felt incredibly heavy in my hand. I did not speak immediately. Instead, I pressed the glowing speakerphone icon and placed the cellular device squarely in the center of the polished mahogany conference table, resting it directly between Mitchell Harrison and Special Agent Thomas Vance. I had driven back to the federal field office at the absolute break of dawn, calculating the exact moment the European time zone would naturally trigger this inevitable financial collapse. The three of us sat in total, unbroken silence, watching the digital call timer on the illuminated screen tick steadily upward. Through the small metallic speaker, I could hear the chaotic, muffled sounds of a busy Parisian street, the frantic, distant honking of European taxis, and the sharp, hyperventilating breaths of my only son. He was panicking. The supreme, untouchable arrogance that had defined his entire adult existence had completely evaporated into the crisp morning air, replaced entirely by the raw, suffocating terror of a man who had just stepped blindly off a steep cliff and finally realized there was absolutely no safety net waiting for him at the bottom. "Dad? Dad, are you there?" Derek's voice was remarkably shrill, completely devoid of its usual smooth, deeply patronizing cadence. He was practically shouting directly into his cellular microphone, his words stumbling carelessly over each other in a desperate, frantic rush. "Dad, thank God you finally answered. Listen to me, something completely terrible has happened. Our personal bank accounts have been completely hacked. Every single credit card we have is declining. The International Bank is saying everything is frozen for suspected fraud, and I absolutely cannot get through to anyone at the primary branch. It is a complete, unmitigated disaster down here." In the chaotic background, I could hear Monica crying loudly, her voice echoing with the distinct, deeply humiliating sting of their recent highly public ejection from the designer luxury boutique. "Dad, we are completely stranded." Derek continued, his tone shifting rapidly into a pathetic, highly manipulative plea. "We are stuck in a foreign country, and we have absolutely zero access to liquid cash. The hotel management is threatening to permanently lock us out of our luxury suite by noon if we do not provide a valid secondary method of payment immediately. You have to go down to your local bank and wire us $10,000 right now. Please, Dad. I will pay you back the absolute second we sort out this massive hacking misunderstanding. We just need a temporary emergency lifeline so we do not end up literally sleeping on the cold streets of France." I slowly looked up at Special Agent Vance. He was casually leaning back in his heavy leather executive chair, a small black digital recording device actively capturing every single frantic syllable of my son's desperate, heavily fabricated narrative. Mitchell Harrison sat completely rigid, his hands folded neatly on the table, his sharp gray eyes fixed intensely on the phone. I leaned forward, bringing my face deliberately close to the microphone. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice or allow a single ounce of residual paternal emotion to bleed into my tone. My voice was ice-cold, carrying the mechanical, completely unyielding precision of a retired structural engineer actively diagnosing a fatal, catastrophic structural flaw. "I cannot do that, Derek," I stated calmly, my words cutting effortlessly through the chaotic background noise of his Parisian nightmare. "I do not have the proper financial authorization to wire you those specific funds." A brief, incredibly confused silence fell heavily over the international line. "What are you talking about, Dad?" Derek stammered, clearly thrown entirely off balance by my completely detached, deeply clinical response. "Of course you have the proper authorization. It is your personal money. Just execute a simple wire transfer from your primary checking account. I am literally begging you, we are completely stranded and out of options." I took a slow, incredibly deep breath, feeling the phantom presence of my deceased wife standing right beside me, silently lending me her quiet, enduring strength for this final confrontation. "I absolutely cannot transfer the money, Derek," I repeated, enunciating every single word with brutal, unwavering clarity. "Because the only person who possesses the legal authorization to sign for those specific financial transfers is Evelyn Caldwell. And as we both know perfectly well, your mother passed away exactly 6 months ago." The line went entirely dead for 10 agonizing seconds. I could practically hear the complex gears in Derek's head grinding to a violent, catastrophic halt as the devastating reality of my carefully chosen words finally slammed into his consciousness. "Dad," he whispered, his voice suddenly hollow, completely stripped of all its previous frantic energy. "What are you saying?" I slowly opened the thick federal case file resting on the table directly in front of me. I am saying that I know exactly what you did, Derek. I continued, my voice echoing loudly off the sterile walls of the federal office. I am looking directly at a highly detailed chronological timeline of your parasitic behavior. I know that on the specific morning of October 14th, while your mother was lying completely unresponsive in a hospital intensive care unit, heavily sedated and breathing through a mechanical ventilator, you somehow miraculously obtained her signature on a legal power of attorney document. I paused, letting the sheer gravity of the impending federal criminal charges settle heavily onto his trembling shoulders. I know that you took that forged, highly illegal document directly to Victor at the classic car dealership and fraudulently liquidated her prized vintage Mustang for fast cash. I know that you systematically drained her dedicated medical funds while she was actively enduring the severe physical agony of intense chemotherapy, deliberately choosing to steal her life savings while she fought a losing tragic battle against terminal cancer. But most importantly, Derek, I know absolutely everything about the $400,000 equity loan. I heard a sharp, sudden gasp from the other end of the line, followed immediately by the pathetic sound of Monica sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. I know that you flawlessly forged my signature as the sole financial guarantor for that massive debt, completely intending to let my retirement home fall into foreclosure while you selfishly drank expensive champagne on a luxury European vacation. You left a permanent digital trail, Derek, and now the federal government has completely frozen your entire stolen life. I have the meticulously maintained leather ledger your mother hid from you. I added, my tone absolute and unrelenting. I have the highlighted banking statements proving every single unauthorized withdrawal you executed. I have the signed affidavits from the intensive care nursing staff confirming her physical incapacitation. You did not outsmart me, Derek. You merely underestimated my ability to systematically deconstruct your web of lies. You assumed my profound grief would render me blind, but you fundamentally failed to understand that an engineer never ignores a compromised foundation. The federal authorities have seized everything. The accounts are locked, the international arrest warrants are being finalized, and there is absolutely no escape. I slowly reached forward, pressed the flashing red button, and permanently ended the call. The silence in the federal conference room lasted for exactly 4 seconds, before the cellular device resting on the polished mahogany table violently erupted into a frantic, shrill ringing. I did not move immediately. I simply stared at the illuminated screen displaying my son's international number, watching the digital alert flash with desperate, unrelenting urgency. Special Agent Thomas Vance leaned slightly forward in his heavy leather chair, offering a single slow nod of encouragement. He tapped the small black digital recording device, ensuring the audio capture remained completely active. Mitchell Harrison sat perfectly still beside me, his sharp gray eyes reflecting the cold, clinical reality of the trap we had flawlessly executed. I reached out with a steady hand, tapped the green icon, and re-engaged the speakerphone. I did not offer a greeting. I allowed the heavy, oppressive silence of the room to transmit directly across the Atlantic Ocean. Dad, please do not hang up on me again. Derek pleaded, his voice completely unrecognizable. The deep, arrogant cadence he had utilized his entire adult life was entirely gone, replaced by the high, breathless pitch of pure, unadulterated terror. He was hyperventilating, his breaths hitching wildly as the sheer crushing magnitude of his situation finally breached his narcissistic armor. You cannot just abandon us here. You have to tell the bank to release the funds. You have to call them right now and tell them this is all a massive misunderstanding. They are going to arrest us, Dad. The hotel manager literally threatened to call the Parisian police. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice remaining as smooth and unyielding as polished steel. There is absolutely no misunderstanding. To clarify, Derek, I stated, measuring every single syllable with brutal precision. And I strongly advise you to speak very clearly and very carefully from this moment forward. You are currently on speakerphone in a secure federal field office in downtown Austin. Sitting directly across from me is Special Agent Thomas Vance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically representing the Financial Crimes Division. He is actively monitoring and permanently recording every single word you say. A sharp, strangled gasp echoed through the small speaker, followed immediately by the sound of Monica weeping hysterically in the background. "The FBI," Derek whispered, the sheer horror practically vibrating through the digital connection. "Dad, what have you done? Are you insane? You went to the federal government?" "I did exactly what an engineer does when he discovers a critical parasitic failure threatening his foundation," I replied, feeling a profound, dark sense of absolute closure settling deeply into my chest. "I systematically neutralized the threat. You genuinely thought I was a clueless, grieving old man who would simply fold under the pressure. You thought your mother was weak. But Evelyn was infinitely stronger than you could ever comprehend. She knew exactly what you were doing, Derek. She deliberately skipped her vital pain medications while her body was ravaged by terminal cancer, just to ensure her account balances remained completely stagnant. She sat in silent, unbearable agony so she could meticulously document every single unauthorized transfer you executed. She left a detailed, handwritten leather ledger securely locked inside a hidden fireproof safe. She mapped out your entire criminal enterprise months before you ever stepped foot inside that classic car dealership. "Dad, I can explain everything," Derek stammered, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed mess. "I was heavily in debt. The business was failing. I was absolutely desperate. Monica was demanding things I could not afford. You forged her signature on a legal power of attorney while she was lying completely unresponsive in a hospital bed, breathing through a mechanical ventilator." I continued, completely ignoring his pathetic attempts to deflect the blame. "You stole the funds meant to keep her comfortable in her final days. You forged my identity to secure a $400,000 equity loan, fully intending to let the bank seize my retirement home while you fled to Europe. I handed the federal investigators the forged mortgage documents, the comprehensive bank statements, and the flawless paper trail your mother built. Every single transaction you initiated in Paris over the past 72 hours has been officially logged as international wire fraud and the interstate transportation of stolen property. You thoroughly documented your own federal crimes on social media for the entire world to witness." "Dad, please!" Derek screamed, his voice breaking entirely as he descended into absolute panic. "We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot do this to us. We are completely stranded in Europe with absolutely nothing. We have no money, no place to stay, and the authorities are looking for us. You have to help us get home." I stared down at the glowing digital screen, feeling the final lingering ghost of my parental affection completely evaporate into the cold, conditioned air of the federal office. I remembered the day he stood in my driveway, callously kicking the tires of Evelyn's beloved, painstakingly restored vintage vehicle. "You said your mother's car was just scrap metal," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous octave that carried the full, crushing weight of my vengeance. "Well, that scrap metal just bought you a one-way ticket to federal prison. Enjoy Paris, Derek. It is your last vacation." I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear another single pathetic excuse or frantic plea for mercy. I reached forward, firmly pressed the red button, and officially ended the conversation. I immediately opened the settings on my cellular device, selected his international contact profile, and permanently blocked the number. I did the exact same thing for Monica's contact profile. I placed the phone back onto the table, feeling a massive, invisible burden lift completely off my shoulders. Special Agent Vance reached out, stopped the digital recording device, and offered a grim, highly professional smile. The trap was permanently sealed. Thousands of miles away, on a crowded historic sidewalk along the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, the brutal reality of their situation finally imploded. Derek stared at the darkened screen of his mobile phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the cobblestones. The connection was completely severed. His father, the man he had always viewed as weak and easily manipulated, had just masterfully engineered his absolute destruction. He turned slowly to look at Monica. She was standing next to a mountain of designer shopping bags. They could no longer keep her face streaked with ruined expensive makeup. "He hung up," Derek whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, helpless realization. "He actually went to the FBI. The accounts are completely gone. We have absolutely nothing left." Monica's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. The luxurious facade she had projected for the entire world completely shattered in a single instant. The reality of federal prison, of losing her social status, and of being utterly destitute on foreign soil crashed into her consciousness. She slowly watched her husband, the man who had promised her an endless life of unearned luxury, and her fear instantly mutated into vicious, completely unfiltered rage. Monica did not whisper. She hurled her expensive leather purse directly at Derek's chest, screaming at the top of her lungs on the crowded Parisian sidewalk. She demanded to know how he could have been so incredibly stupid, how he could have underestimated the man he mocked as a weak, grieving widow. Derek flinched, frantically, shushing her, begging her to lower her voice before the French police arrived. They were forced to leave the stack of luxury bags where they sat, walking away from tens of thousands of dollars in designer goods they could no longer legally possess. They sprinted toward the nearest metro station, their hearts hammering with the adrenaline of hunted criminals. When they finally pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the hotel, hoping to retreat to the safety of their opulent suite, they found the security director waiting patiently in the gilded lobby. Their electronic key cards had already been deactivated. The hotel management had received the international fraud alert from their credit card issuer. The director, accompanied by 2 large security guards, escorted them to their room, standing silently by the door, while my son and his wife frantically shoved their wrinkled clothing into their suitcases. They were not permitted to use the bathroom. They were escorted down the service elevator, bypassing the glamorous lobby entirely, and deposited onto a damp side street next to the commercial dumpsters. The manager politely informed them that they were officially banned from the premises, and any attempt to return would result in immediate criminal trespassing charges. The harsh reality of their situation began to set in as the heavy doors locked behind them. They were alone in a city that only catered to the wealthy. The shock of the sudden eviction finally shattered whatever fragile bond remained between them. Dragging their heavy luggage over the uneven cobblestones, the romantic facade of their marriage completely dissolved into a toxic, venomous screaming match. Monica stopped in the middle of a public square, her face red and distorted with fury. She blamed Derek. She accused him of being a sloppy amateur who could not even successfully forge a signature without leaving a massive trail for federal investigators to follow. She screamed he had ruined her entire life, that she was going to end up in a federal penitentiary because she listened to his idiotic schemes. Derek, completely stripped of his usual unearned confidence, finally snapped. He fired back with equal venom, his voice echoing loudly off the historic buildings. He reminded her that it was her insatiable greed that had driven them to this exact point. He yelled that he never would have drained those medical accounts so aggressively if she had not constantly demanded a newer vehicle, a much bigger house, and endless designer clothing. He pointed a trembling finger at her, stating that her absolute obsession with posting every single luxury purchase on social media was exactly what provided the federal agents with their live, irrefutable tracking data. They stood in the beautiful city of light, entirely consumed by mutual hatred, realizing they were chained together in a sinking ship of their own creation. Every word they exchanged was a bitter reminder of their impending doom. The pedestrians walking past them stared with open judgment, observing 2 previously wealthy individuals tearing each other apart in public. With the sun slowly setting and the temperature dropping rapidly, they had absolutely nowhere to go. They pooled the last few physical euros they possessed in their pockets and purchased 2 tickets on the commuter train heading directly to the international airport. They hoped they could negotiate at the airline counter praying they could somehow adjust their return flights and escape before the European authorities received the official federal warrants. They dragged their heavy bags up to the first-class counter, attempting to use their frequent flyer status to demand an immediate flight change. The ticketing agent typed their names into the system, frowned deeply, and informed them that their original tickets had been purchased with a card flagged for severe international fraud. The airline could not alter the itinerary without a valid secondary form of payment to cover the massive administrative change fees. When Derek failed to produce a working credit card, the agent coldly asked them to step aside for paying customers. They were completely trapped. As midnight fell over the massive, echoing airport terminal, my son and his wife were forced to find a secluded row of uncomfortable metal chairs near a closed food court. They spent their anniversary night shivering under their thin coats, sleeping on the hard, unforgiving floor of a public transit hub. They split a single stale bag of potato chips purchased from a glowing vending machine. As Monica lay on her makeshift bed of luggage, her cellular phone began to vibrate constantly. Her thousands of devoted social media followers had noticed the sudden, uncharacteristic radio silence. Comments and direct messages flooded her screen, asking why the glamorous updates from Paris had abruptly ceased. The stark, incredibly humiliating contrast between her highly curated digital fantasy and her pathetic physical reality pushed her into a quiet, trembling panic attack in the dark. She desperately wanted to turn the phone off, but she could not stop staring at the glowing screen, watching her false empire crumble. She wept silently, mourning the loss of the stolen money and the artificial respect it commanded. By the time the morning sun filtered through the massive glass windows of the airport terminal, they were completely exhausted, painfully hungry, and smelling of stale sweat and desperation. Derek realized they had exhausted every available option. They could not access their banks. They could not call their friends, knowing the federal investigators were likely already knocking on doors back in Texas. They had only one devastating, humiliating avenue left. They gathered their luggage and took the train back into the city center, walking the final miles to the guarded gates of the United States Embassy. They stood in the slow-moving line with tourists who had lost their passports, their expensive designer clothing wrinkled and stained. When Derek finally reached the reinforced glass window of the consular office, he had to completely swallow his massive pride. He had to look a low-level government bureaucrat in the eyes and admit that he was entirely destitute. He had to beg the federal government for an emergency repatriation loan to secure safe passage back to American soil. The consular officer processed the paperwork with a slow, agonizing bureaucracy, making Derek sign a strict, legally binding promissory note to the federal government. They were not granted first-class accommodations. They were issued 2 standard non-refundable economy tickets, seated in the very last row of a commercial airliner near the lavatories. As my son signed his name to the federal debt, he knew exactly what was waiting for him at the end of that incredibly long flight. He knew that the very second the airplane wheels touched the tarmac in the United States, federal agents would be waiting at the arrival gate with heavy steel handcuffs. The ultimate price for their parasitic arrogance was finally coming due in full. The agonizing flight from Paris to Austin took exactly 10 hours and 45 minutes. For my son and his wife trapped in the cramped, uncomfortable economy seats near the rear lavatories, it must have felt like a lifetime of pure, uninterrupted psychological torture. I did not need to be physically present on that airplane to know exactly how they spent those excruciating hours. They did not sit in quiet, reflective remorse for what they had done to Evelyn or to me. Instead, they spent the entire journey constructing a massive, delusional fantasy. Derek, fueled by decades of unchecked arrogance, successfully convinced Monica and himself that he could simply talk his way out of this disaster. He reasoned that I was still just a grieving, emotionally vulnerable old man who was lashing out in a moment of profound, temporary anger. He firmly believed that if he could just get from the airport terminal to my front porch, he could deploy his usual weaponized charm. He planned to beg, to cry, and to leverage our biological relationship to force me into dropping the federal charges. He thought he could manipulate my foundational desire for a unified family, promising to repay the stolen money over time, and swearing to become the devoted son I always wanted. He fundamentally failed to understand that the father who might have listened to those pathetic, hollow promises was completely dead and gone. As the heavy commercial airliner finally descended through the thick Texas clouds, the cabin filled with the usual restless energy of arriving passengers. Derek and Monica remained glued to their seats. Their expensive designer clothing hopelessly wrinkled their faces, pale and exhausted. They waited for the aisles to clear, clutching their carry-on bags with sweaty, trembling hands. When the heavy cabin doors finally opened, they shuffled out into the brightly lit jet bridge. They were completely exhausted, operating on pure adrenaline and the desperate, foolish hope that they could simply march into my living room and demand an immediate ceasefire. They walked slowly up the inclined ramp, rehearsing the exact script of lies they planned to deliver to me. They stepped out of the narrow tunnel and directly into the bustling, crowded arrival terminal of the Austin airport. They fully expected to simply walk past the waiting crowds, retrieve their luggage, and hail a cab to my retirement home. They expected to face me on their own terms. But I was not waiting for them at the arrival gate. I was sitting comfortably in my quiet living room watching the local evening news with a fresh cup of dark coffee. Instead of a vulnerable father, Derek and Monica were immediately intercepted by the absolute uncompromising reality of the United States federal justice system. Two incredibly imposing individuals, dressed in crisp, dark suits, stepped smoothly out of the waiting crowd, completely blocking their path. It was Special Agent Thomas Vance and a senior female agent from the Financial Crimes Division. They did not offer a polite greeting. They did not ask my son how his flight was. They moved with the terrifying, highly coordinated precision of seasoned predators securing their designated targets. Agent Vance stepped directly into Derek's personal space, flashing his gold federal badge with a swift, practiced motion. He stated my son's full legal name, his voice projecting a loud, authoritative command that instantly silenced the surrounding crowd of travelers. The bustling airport terminal suddenly became an impromptu, highly public theater. Dozens of arriving passengers stopped in their tracks, turning their heads to watch the dramatic scene unfold. Monica froze completely, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as she realized there would be absolutely no quiet family negotiation. There would be no private, tearful apology in my living room. Before Derek could even open his mouth to utter a single pathetic excuse, Agent Vance firmly grabbed his right shoulder and spun him violently around. The heavy metallic click of solid steel handcuffs echoing through the terminal was the exact sound of my son's arrogant empire completely collapsing. The female agent mirrored the motion perfectly, securing Monica's wrists behind her back as she began to sob uncontrollably. The physical reality of the cold steel binding their hands instantly shattered the delusional fantasy they had constructed on the airplane. Agent Vance stood directly behind my son and began reading him his Miranda rights. He did not rush the process. He spoke with loud, deliberate clarity, ensuring every single word resonated through the crowded terminal. He publicly informed Derek that he was being officially placed under federal arrest. He listed the specific devastating charges: grand theft, severe elder financial abuse, international wire fraud, the interstate transportation of stolen property, and the malicious forgery of legal banking documents. Each charge Vance listed carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Monica was practically screaming now, begging the agents to let her go, shrieking that it was all a terrible misunderstanding and that her husband had forced her to participate. She was instantly turning on Derek, entirely abandoning their unified front the very second she faced tangible, severe consequences. The female agent simply tightened her grip, advising Monica that anything she screamed in this crowded public terminal could and absolutely would be used against her in a court of law. Derek did not fight back. He did not scream or beg. He stood perfectly still, his head hanging down in total, paralyzing defeat. As the agents forcefully marched them through the massive airport concourse, flanked by staring strangers and murmuring crowds, The absolute crushing weight of the justice system finally broke him. He was stripped of his premium credit cards, his luxury hotel suites, and his expensive, tailored facade. He was no longer a wealthy, successful entrepreneur, taking a romantic European vacation. He was a common, thoroughly documented criminal, being publicly escorted to a holding cell. He was going to spend the night in a stark, concrete federal processing center, stripped of his freedom and his dignity. He would trade his expensive designer clothing for a standardized, deeply humiliating orange uniform. He would face a relentless, heavily armed prosecution team equipped with his mother's meticulous ledger, his explicitly forged signature, and his own highly public, hopelessly incriminating social media posts. There would be absolutely no expensive legal defense capable of dismantling the chronological timeline we had flawlessly constructed. His boundless arrogance had finally met a completely immovable object. The clueless old man had quietly engineered a masterclass in absolute destruction, and Derek was completely, permanently ruined. He had absolutely nothing left in his life but his deep, unyielding regret and the cold, terrifying certainty of the massive prison sentence waiting for him in the very near future. The financial trap I had meticulously designed was now perfectly closed, securing my hard-earned retirement home from their toxic reach. Evelyn could finally rest in absolute peace, knowing her incredible sacrifice was not in vain. I slowly turned off the evening news, placed my coffee cup down on the kitchen counter, and allowed myself to finally breathe. The relentless storm had finally passed, leaving me standing quietly alone in the victorious silence of true, absolute, undeniable justice. 4 months passed before I saw them again. The relentless Texas summer had faded into a crisp, unforgiving autumn by the time I walked through the heavy double doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Austin. The courtroom was entirely devoid of the luxurious warmth Derek and Monica had once believed was their absolute birthright. It was a sterile, highly sanitized environment constructed of polished oak, cold marble, and complete unyielding authority. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, resting my hands quietly on the wooden rail. I did not wear a tailored suit to impress anyone. I wore the simple, comfortable cardigan Evelyn had bought for me during our last anniversary together. I sat perfectly still, listening to the low hum of the air conditioning, waiting for the final chapter of this tragic saga to officially conclude. The heavy side door opened, and the bailiff led them into the room. The physical transformation was deeply shocking. My son, the man who used to mock my simple lifestyle while sipping imported champagne, was now drowning in a standardized, incredibly bright orange federal jumpsuit. His designer haircut had grown out into a messy, unkempt tangle. His posture, once defined by a boundless, aggressive arrogance, was entirely broken. He shuffled forward with his head bowed, the heavy steel chains around his ankles clinking loudly against the polished floor. Monica walked right behind him, looking absolutely hollowed out. Her expensive highlights had faded into dull, mousy roots. Her face, completely stripped of its premium cosmetics, was pale and sunken. They did not look at each other. The toxic alliance that had driven them to steal from a dying woman had completely shattered under the crushing weight of federal confinement. They were guided to the defense table, sitting next to a weary public defender who looked entirely exhausted by the sheer volume of irrefutable evidence stacked against them. There would be no dramatic trial. There would be no clever, expensive legal maneuvers to muddy the waters or twist the truth. The paper trail I had meticulously provided to Special Agent Vance was absolutely airtight. The forged power of attorney, the heavily documented theft of Evelyn's medical funds, the fraudulent $400,000 equity loan strapped to my home, and the massive international wire transfers had cornered them entirely. The federal prosecutor had initially offered them a brutal 20-year sentence if they dared to waste the court's time with a futile trial. Facing the terrifying prospect of spending 2 decades behind concrete walls, their massive egos completely collapsed. They had signed a comprehensive plea agreement fully admitting to every single count of grand theft, severe elder financial abuse, aggravated wire fraud, and malicious forgery. I watched the presiding federal judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and absolutely zero patience for familial predators, rifle through the thick stack of signed confessions. She looked down from her elevated bench, her expression radiating profound, undisguised disgust. The judge did not waste her breath offering them a lecture on morality. She simply read the agreed-upon terms of their surrender into the official public record. She detailed how they had systematically preyed upon a terminally ill woman, exploiting her agonizing final days to fund a lavish, entirely unearned lifestyle. She noted the incredible cruelty of their actions, highlighting the sheer depravity required to steal from a dying mother and a grieving father. Derek closed his eyes tightly, tears finally leaking down his gaunt cheeks, but I felt absolutely nothing for him. His tears were not born of genuine remorse for what he did to Evelyn. He was simply crying for himself, mourning the permanent loss of his freedom and his stolen wealth. Monica stared blankly at the wooden table, her body trembling slightly, as the judge formally announced the mandatory punishment. They were each sentenced to serve exactly 7 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. 7 years of eating standardized food, sleeping on thin mattresses, and being completely stripped of their identities. But the justice system did not stop at their physical incarceration. The judge moved swiftly to the financial restitution phase, bringing the heavy hammer of the law down on their material greed. The luxurious, sprawling suburban mansion they had proudly paraded on social media was officially seized by the banking institutions. Every single piece of premium furniture, every imported appliance, and every expensive vehicle was repossessed to satisfy their massive, heavily defaulted debts. The judge specifically ordered that every single designer item Monica had accumulated using Evelyn's stolen medical funds be immediately confiscated by the state. The massive collection of luxury handbags, the premium shoes, the imported silk garments, and the expensive jewelry were all cataloged and scheduled for a highly publicized government auction. The total proceeds of that humiliating public sale were legally mandated to be paid directly to me, ensuring full financial restitution for the fraudulent equity loan they had maliciously strapped to my retirement property. The glittering, artificial empire they had built upon a foundation of theft and deception was completely dismantled in less than 20 minutes. They were left with absolutely nothing but the orange clothes on their backs and the cold steel wrapped securely around their wrists. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing like a final gunshot through the quiet courtroom. The formal proceedings were officially terminated. The bailiff stepped forward, commanding Derek and Monica to stand. As they were turned around to be escorted back through the heavy side door, my son finally lifted his head. His desperate, bloodshot eyes found mine across the empty rows of the gallery. He looked at me with a pathetic, shattered expression, silently pleading for a single ounce of paternal pity. He wanted me to offer him a comforting nod, a sign that I still loved him, despite the monstrous things he had done. I did not give him that satisfaction. I simply looked back at him, with the cold, unyielding neutrality of a man looking at a complete stranger. I did not feel a single drop of joy or vindictive triumph. Joy is an emotion reserved for celebrations and victories. This was a profound tragedy, a deeply unfortunate necessity. I felt exactly the same way an experienced surgeon feels after successfully amputating a deeply gangrenous limb. It was a brutal, physically traumatic procedure, but it was absolutely essential to stop the toxic rot from spreading and destroying the rest of the healthy body. I watched the heavy wooden door close firmly behind them, permanently sealing them inside the relentless machinery of the federal prison system. The loud click of the iron latch was the exact sound of my absolute liberation. I remained seated in the quiet gallery for a few moments longer, listening to the fading footsteps of the armed guards echoing down the secure hallway. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, slightly worn photograph of Evelyn. She was smiling brightly, standing proudly next to her fully restored vintage Mustang on a warm Texas afternoon. I quietly smiled, feeling entirely whole and finally at absolute peace. Exactly 1 week after I watched the federal agents escort my son out of the international airport in cold steel handcuffs, I found myself pulling into the pristine, brightly illuminated parking lot of the luxury classic car dealership. The crisp morning air felt remarkably fresh, entirely devoid of the suffocating weight that had relentlessly crushed my chest for the past 6 months. I walked through the towering glass doors with a quiet, undeniable sense of profound purpose. The showroom was a massive, pristine sanctuary of polished chrome gleaming automotive paint and immaculate mechanical perfection. I did not have to search for long. Sitting directly in the absolute center of the main viewing floor, bathed in the brilliant, unyielding glow of a dozen high-intensity halogen spotlights, was the magnificent prize. The fully restored vintage 1969 Ford Mustang looked utterly spectacular. The deep, rich, metallic paint sparkled flawlessly under the artificial light, completely erasing the tragic, pathetic reality of my son, practically giving it away for mere pennies. Victor emerged from his glass office, a deeply apologetic, uncomfortable expression plastered across his face. He knew the federal authorities had thoroughly contacted him regarding the highly fraudulent, heavily forged power of attorney. He quickly handed over the original keys and the official title documentation without a single word of protest. The federal government had already seized the illicit funds Derek had initially received, and Victor was terrified of facing criminal conspiracy charges. I slowly walked around the beautiful vehicle, lightly running my hand along the smooth, cool surface of the immaculate hood. I could practically see Evelyn sitting proudly in the driver's seat, wearing her favorite silk scarf and smiling radiantly. It was a stunning machine, a true mechanical masterpiece forged through thousands of hours of intense, dedicated labor. But as I stood there, looking at the pristine leather interior, I made a profound, unexpected realization. This beautiful car was a passionate project, a brilliant dream, but it was not my actual future. Driving it alone would only serve as a constant, heavy reminder of the tragic illness that stole her away and the profound familial betrayal that followed. The vehicle deserved to be driven, admired, and cherished by someone who could appreciate its incredible history without the suffocating shadow of my personal grief. I turned back to face Victor, firmly placing the heavy metal keys squarely onto his polished glass counter. I informed him that I was officially consigning the vehicle. I instructed him to enter the prized Mustang into the upcoming highly exclusive National Classic Automotive Auction. I wanted the car sold to the highest possible bidder. 3 weeks later, I sat quietly in the back row of a massive, crowded auction house. The atmosphere was incredibly electric, filled with wealthy collectors and passionate enthusiasts. When the beloved masterpiece finally rolled onto the brightly lit auction block, a hushed, reverent silence fell over the massive room. The energetic auctioneer began the rapid bidding process, his loud, rhythmic voice echoing loudly over the premium sound system. The final winning bid completely shattered all previous initial estimates. The beautiful, flawlessly restored vehicle officially sold for exactly $150,000. The massive crowd erupted into thunderous applause, completely unaware of the deep, tragic history hidden beneath that gleaming metallic paint. I quietly slipped out of the crowded building through a side exit, holding a certified financial check that represented the final tangible piece of her incredible physical legacy. Combined with the massive restitution funds I legally recovered from the immediate liquidation of the seized suburban luxury mansion, my banking accounts were completely restored. I possessed a significant amount of capital, but I absolutely refused to let that money sit idly in a silent, forgotten account. I needed to transform the profound pain of the previous year into something undeniably positive, something that would genuinely honor the incredible, unbroken strength of the woman I loved. I scheduled a formal meeting with the administrative board of the premier regional mechanical trade school. It was an excellent, highly respected vocational institution dedicated to teaching young, ambitious individuals the honorable, incredibly complex art of automotive repair and massive restoration. I sat down with the primary school director, presenting a comprehensive, legally binding financial trust document. Using the combined auction proceeds and the fully recovered medical funds, I officially established a permanent, heavily endowed financial grant. I named it the Evelyn Caldwell Memorial Scholarship. I clearly outlined the specific inflexible criteria for the generous annual financial awards. The substantial funds would completely cover the comprehensive tuition costs, the expensive specialized tools, and the living expenses for promising, dedicated students who demonstrated absolute mechanical brilliance and, most importantly, unimpeachable personal integrity. I wanted to actively support young, hardworking individuals who deeply understood the true foundational value of earning an honest living. I explicitly demanded that the scholarship strictly favor students coming from difficult, underprivileged backgrounds, giving them a vital, powerful lifeline to build their own successful, legitimate careers. I wanted to help cultivate a new generation of skilled, ethical professionals who would never dream of exploiting the vulnerable or stealing from their own families. When I formally signed the final endowment papers, placing the substantial monetary funds permanently into the institutional trust, a profound, warming sense of true closure washed completely over my tired soul. I had successfully transformed a dark, malicious betrayal into a permanent, glowing beacon of profound educational opportunity. The malicious parasites who had relentlessly tried to completely drain my life, to publicly humiliate me, and to steal my secure future were now locked away in a cold, concrete federal facility. My son and his wife were currently wearing rough, humiliating institutional clothing, eating bland, standardized cafeteria food, and facing a long, terrifying decade of total confinement. They had completely destroyed their own lives through sheer, unadulterated greed. I, on the other hand, was entirely free. I drove slowly back to my quiet, peaceful retirement home as the golden afternoon sun began to slowly set behind the distant Texas hills. I pulled into the familiar driveway, parking my practical, reliable truck, and walked slowly toward the detached garage. I pressed the small plastic button on the remote, watching the heavy metal door smoothly roll upward on its greased mechanical tracks. The massive interior space was completely empty. The shiny, magnificent vintage Mustang no longer occupied the center bay. There were no scattered tools, no lingering smell of fresh motor oil, and no heavy mechanical projects waiting to be completed. The space was utterly bare, simply a quiet, polished concrete floor illuminated by the warm, fading light of the dying afternoon sun. I walked over to the sturdy wooden workbench located in the far back corner. Resting quietly on the clean surface was a simple, elegant wooden frame holding my absolute favorite photograph of her. She was smiling with that brilliant, fierce spark of undeniable vitality that had initially captured my heart over 40 years ago. I stood there in the profound, unbroken silence, lightly touching the smooth glass, covering her beautiful face. The physical space was empty, but my life finally found absolute peace. The parasites were gone. The legacy survived. There is a dangerous misconception that family blood provides an unconditional shield against true accountability. It certainly does not. When toxic entitlement turns into malicious exploitation and pure greed completely overrides basic human decency, stepping away is never an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of survival. True respect is always earned, never simply inherited. The meticulous courage my wife displayed taught me that protecting a legacy requires closing the door on those who seek to destroy it. You cannot heal a parasite by feeding it more. Justice, even involving your own flesh, is the ultimate true love. If this story gave you the courage to stand up against exploitation, please hit the like button to support this channel today. Subscribe so you never miss my upcoming stories. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? Let us share our strength together.